Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And we're going to start today by letting you know that the author and I agreed in advance that this book is not totally about what it says it is. Now, it has to start with a very long title. I'm never comfortable with long titles, but this has a long title. It is called Brave Dragons, a Chinese basketball team and American coach, and two cultures clashing. Ooh. The author is Jim Yardley, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and it is published by Alfred A. Knopf. Welcome.
Thank you, Jim. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. And we also understand why, when they send material out on a book like this, that they emphasize the basketball part, because they don't want to scare people away. But in a sense, the book is very informative, very revealing, fascinating, because of the way you look at China. You've lived there, and in a sense report back to us what it's all about through this story about the Brave Dragons.
Well, Jim, I appreciate that, and you've grasped what I was trying to do. I've lived in China for 6 years, from 2003 to 2009. I was working with the New York Times, and I got very interested in this idea of the kind of intermingling of the U.S. Culture and Chinese culture. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to find what was seemingly an apolitical way to explore it at a personal level, not at sort of in a wonky way. And I grew up in North Carolina, and I like basketball. And basketball had a great history, actually,
in China. If you grew up in North Carolina, you damn well better like basketball.
You don't get to come back if you don't like it. So it was. It seemed like a natural, and there was a really interesting history there. You know, basketball had been in China as long as it had been in the United States. So by looking at it, you could talk about the two countries and their relationship, and that's what interested me. And I got lucky with this team out in the middle of coal country. It had a lot of big personalities.
The other one of the main characters in your story is the coach of the team,
right? The
coach of the Brave Dragons. His name is Bob Weiss. He played in the NBA. He was a guard, overshadowed by superstars like Jordan. No, with Jordan
he played on some tough Chicago Bulls team with Jerry Sloan.
Right. And he was a coach and then an assistant coach in the NBA. One might say that as we meet him in the book, his coaching career is on the decline.
Yeah, he had been a head coach 3 times in San Antonio, Atlanta, and with the L.A. Clippers. And not many coaches survive the L.A. Clippers. And he had gone to Seattle as a longtime assistant and had kind of made a life and had sort of resigned to being assistant. And then unexpectedly, he became the head coach. But it didn't last long, and with the Supersonics in Seattle. And he got fired, and the team later was taken out of the city. And he was sort of at loose ends of what he wanted to do. He had cancer. He had prostate cancer surgery, and so for a while there, his health was an issue. And kind of out of the blue came this offer to go coach in China. And Bob Weiss had rarely left the United States. He'd kind of been intimidated about leaving the United States. He'd have finally made a trip to Europe, and then he did once go to China on a coaching clinic. But otherwise, he was kind of the classic case of just going in blind.
Stay at home.
Yeah.
Stay at home. Now, we could discuss for a long time, what's the difference between the United States and China.
Right.
But at the end of the first chapter, you tell us all we need to know as you talk about how Mr. Weiss checked into his first hotel.
Right. Well, I'll read you that.
Thanks.
No problem. And it is so Bob has just flown from Seattle to Beijing. He had thought that he was going to be spending a week acclimating in Beijing and watching the Olympics. And instead, he is unexpectedly whisked to Taiyuan, which is in the middle of China, very polluted coal capital. He doesn't know anybody in the country. He doesn't speak a single word of Chinese, and he's been taken there with his interpreter, whose English name is Joe, and he's greeted at the airport by the general manager. And the general manager is a young guy named Zhang Beihai. And Zhang Beihai says, "Welcome to Taiyuan," he said in Chinese, and they walked outside into the hot evening air for the ride to Weiss's hotel. They soon arrived at one of the tallest skyscrapers in downtown Taiyuan, a glass building, unremarkable except that the glass was tinted the color of a ripe banana. It was too dark, and Weiss was too exhausted to notice the color, but what seemed familiar was the Howard Johnson signs shining atop the building, an emblem of unpretentious Middle America gleaming in the central China night. Weiss took comfort in the sign. So much was already unfamiliar. He had moved to a city whose name he could barely pronounce to coach a team he knew nothing about, other than it was very, very bad. He had not understood anything anyone had said to him all day, except for Joe, and Joe was now leaving for the night. Weiss rode the elevator to his room and opened the door and walked in. The overstuffed furniture was old and stained and crowded together in the small room. He smelled the acrid odor of stale cigarettes. There was a combined bedroom and living room, and the tiny bathroom appeared to be missing essential parts. There was a small sink and toilet, but the shower nozzle poked out of a wall next to the toilet. There was no tub, no shower stall. The entire bathroom was the shower stall. When Weiss flipped on the water and stepped under the nozzle, most of the water sprayed upward, where it performed a bank shot off the ceiling before splattering down onto Weiss, the toilet, the sink, and the rest of the bathroom. His shower had flooded the bathroom. Weiss flicked on the television. He had been promised international cable service, but every channel was in Chinese except for one with news updates from Canada. He opened his Apple laptop, but the room lacked the promised internet connection, so he collapsed on the bed, disconnected from the world he had known, and fell asleep. When he awoke in the morning and stepped outside, he learned two things. He was living in a yellow skyscraper, and the Howard Johnsons was not actually a Howard Johnson. The familiar Howard Johnson sign sat atop the yellow building, but a less conspicuous English sign above the door identified the hotel as the Howell and Johnson. Bob Weiss had spent his first night in China at a knockoff Hojo.
That's a wonderful way to be welcomed to China. I think many people just turn around and go home.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. Well, as we get further on into the books, we are going to find out that there are two dominating figures, Boss Wang or Wong?
Boss Wong.
Boss Wong. And one of our favorites here in the U.S., good old David Stern.
Oh, yeah.
Stay tuned. You'll meet them both.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Today it's an Alfred A. Knopf book with a long title, Brave Dragons, a Chinese basketball team, an American coach, and two cultures clashing. The author is Jim Yardley, and he's with us. Thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure.
A gentleman by the name of Brian Burrow talked about your book, and he said, in part, Jim Yardley's wonderful book not only provides a unique prism for understanding today's China, but is as entertaining a book as I've read in some time. It's also a basketball fan's delight. And I think that's a good way to describe the book, and at the end say it's a basketball fan's delight, but it's also a lot more.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. And Brian obviously did me a great, said a lot of nice things. That was great of him.
Now, you know, one of the things, one of the people, I don't know whether we mentioned her or not, but I'm curious about how did Tracy, Bob's wife, get along in China, and with the Chinese players? I mean, there are little drop-ins about her as you read the book, but I mean, in some, how do you see her over there?
She really loves China. And she was so eager to get there, and that was part of their experience. You know, the coaching experience eventually became quite complicated and comical for Bob, but
I'll say,
yeah. But the exploring a new culture they really loved, and Tracy in particular threw herself into things and sort of became a den mother, if you will, to the Chinese players because they were all living in this concrete dormitory. They essentially spent 11 months of the year there. They lived 2 to a room. They lived kind of in glorified factory conditions, if you will, except it was a basketball factory. So she sort of became their den mother, and she went all over the country and really threw herself into the place. She loved it.
The conditions of Bob's job were really set down by the boss,
right?
And it was very, very strange. I mean, Weiss is barely there. I don't know whether he's even put his fanny on the bench when he goes from coach to assistant coach.
I have a chapter which I call The Purge, and a purge is something that's pretty familiar to folks who know a little bit about China. And Bob, Bob was interesting. The owner is a guy named Wang Xingjiang, but everyone called him in Chinese Wang Laoban, which translates as Boss Wang.
And rightly so.
And rightly so. He is every bit a boss. And he's a guy who, when he was born, frankly, to a peasant family. And then he eventually became a multimillionaire. He became a steel baron, if you will. And he just got incredibly rich, but then he had this deep passion for basketball. Ever since he was a teenager, he played in the factory where he used to work. He played, and then he became obsessed with the NBA. When the NBA started being televised in China in basically the 1990s, late 80s, he became a huge fan. So suddenly, when he's really rich, he buys himself a team. And he wants to make his players play like the guys he sees on television. So that's why he hires Bob Weiss. He brings Bob in. I use a phrase in the book. He's like a technology transfer. They want, he want to take his advanced basketball concepts and thinking and apply them to this Chinese team. And Bob arrives and he takes over. And for several weeks, he's practicing with the team, and he's introducing an NBA offense and team defense and all these concepts. But he's also loosening the reins a little bit. He's not holding curfew meetings. He's giving the players a little more freedom. And some of the players are acting out a little bit. And so what happens is this makes the boss nervous. At one level, he wants all these great American concepts. At the other level, he doesn't want to surrender the sort of control and command structure for the team that's very prevalent in China. So,
and at one point, you write, he ran the team the way he ran his steel mills, as a fiefdom defined by hard work and ruthlessness. And he fired many coaches. Anybody who was resistant to learning what he believed to be the NBA way of doing things was out the door.
It was sort of comical that the players would grouse that in the morning, because in games in China are shown in the morning, because that's the time change. He would watch Steve Nash or Chris Paul, and he would come to practice, and he would instantly want his players doing what Steve Nash or Chris Paul did. And but he was a very determined, complicated guy, and so. It's, his tenacity is one of the things I do admire about him. I mean, he was, and some people who've read this book have told me that he seemed like George Steinbrenner and Mark Cuban blended together. and he sat on the bench, which was basically against the policy.
Against rules.
But he did it anyway. And he sat there and he got frustrated and he would interfere with the coaching and he would try to make substitutions. He would try to take over the huddle. And so at one point when he pulled Bob from being the head coach. He was the head coach in practice, and he went to the media. The media thought he was the head coach, but in actuality, the Chinese assistant who the boss had brought in was running practice. And between the boss and the Chinese assistant, they were trying to run the games. And they did that for a while, and then they put Bob back in charge again. So it kind of went back and forth. Throughout the season. One
of the things that is deep in the book is basketball in China.
Right.
And deeply into that is a guy who, rightly saw China as a market almost beyond compare in terms of the amount of money that one could make there.
David Stern.
Yes.
Yeah, the story of the NBA is an interesting story in China. Stern, sort of a famous meeting now in 1987. I don't think he'd been commissioner, but for a few years. Mm-hmm. Recognized well before any of the other American sports leagues that globalization was going to change sports, and that television games could become tangible commodities that you could ship across borders. So he wanted to get the NBA in China. So he went to China, and he offered basically free highlights. And they began showing them on state television, and eventually more and more television, to the point when China began going through its economic reforms in the 80s and 90s, and more content was shown on TV, more and more people watched the NBA, and the NBA became sort of a lifestyle brand, and very popular and successful at that time. Had some problems since.
One of the things we learned from reading the book is that every CBA, Chinese Basketball Association team, wants good American players.
Yes, they do.
Sometimes when you get what you wish for, it doesn't. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Hey, that's me, Jim Foster. Brave Dragons is the title, the subtitle, a Chinese basketball team, an American coach, and Two Cultures Clashing by Jim Yardley, published by our friends at Alfred A. Knopf, and praised very fulsomely by a man who has a book with a longer title than our guest today. His name is Richard Bernstein, and pay attention for what he says. Jim Yardley's terrific book, telling the story of an obscure Chinese basketball team and its American coach, opens a vivid window on an unexpected item in the broader Sino-American encounter. And it does so not just perceptively but entertainingly as well. Nobody should mistake Brave Dragons for a sports book alone. Yes, it's full of action, down to the wire game descriptions and stuff like that. Full of action, big personalities, and excitement. But it's also a universal story of human striving and cultural collision. It's all of that. And one of the universal stories in there is what I alluded to on the way out of the second segment. And sometimes you wish so hard for what you want, and when you get it, ooh, not so good. We have a story within the story here, don't we, about kind of like that? With that basketball player, he got his star finally, and he came over, and then he wouldn't play.
Oh, Bonzi Wells.
Bonzi, yes, good old Bonzi boy.
Bonzi's an interesting character. Bonzi was a big player in the NBA. He had a good career. He had a reputation, not the greatest reputation in the NBA. He had a reputation of being a tough teammate, or tough for coaches and fans. So there was he had a bad rep. But he came to China for a couple of things. He wanted to prove to the NBA he could still play. He also, I think, had a shoe deal at stake. So he came to China in the middle of the season. Boss Wong had given him a contract, the biggest contract in the league. But what Bonzi didn't know
is exactly the kind of thing that Wong has to do.
He's got to.
It has to be the biggest.
He's good at that. And but what Bonzi didn't know is what he was getting into. He first of all didn't even know he was going to Taiyuan in central China. He thought he was going to Taiwan on the coast. and it's really not even his fault. He just showed up, and he also, what he didn't know that was most important was he was the biggest star at that point in the league to ever play in the Chinese league, and the media followed him everywhere. He was under a microscope and didn't even really know it. So it created some comical situations because he's a very fiery guy and fiery player on the court. Well, Boss Wong, as you figured out, is a fiery guy and a fiery guy on and off the court as well. So Boss Wong respected Bonzi and they clashed. And it was interesting, when Bonzi first got there was some question of whether he'd even play, because they didn't want him to even let him practice with his team. They just wanted him to run right out there. And, he's an NBA professional. He wants to scrimmage with his team.
Sure.
And that went on for a while, but he finally played his first game. And
that whole issue of scrimmage,
yeah.
I mean, it's not just that he wouldn't get a chance to scrimmage. Often, under the assistant coach, the
Right.
one that kind of replaced Weiss and then got
Right.
replaced, they didn't scrimmage.
No,
They just ran up and down the court and did layups.
The Americans truly thought it was the craziest thing they'd ever seen. I think the Chinese coach, again, there's this thinking of Chinese coaches that you just need to work. That Chinese guy, it's like hammering iron, and that by repetitive drilling over and over again, this guy's philosophy was he would make his Chinese players better. But he never worked on how they played together as a team. He never worked on team defense. He didn't know much about offense. So when he first got there, and Bonzi said, well, let's do the stuff a normal team does, this wasn't a normal team. They weren't doing it.
No, they weren't.
No.
But were the other teams in the league at that time about the same? Did they have the same kind of crazy coaching?
No, I mean, there's a mixture. There are plenty of teams that have this similar setup. No one's quite as extreme as Boss Wong. When I got with that team, I didn't know what I was getting either. So for me, it was great. But I mean, one of the points I try to make in the book, there's a chapter called "The Promised Land," and that's toward the end of the book when they go down and they play against the team that's the best team in the league, and they use much more progressive training methods, practice. Their players have shoe contracts. It's a much more sort of enlightened attitude. And my point of that is to try to show that there are pockets where good change is happening. So, and this team, by the way, wins the championship every single year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
You would think the lesson would get across.
There's a moment at the end of the book that I found very, very moving. Before the last game, instead of showing game film,
right,
Weiss shows a slide presentation developed by his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks. Your warmth, kindness, and love have filled each day with laughter and tears. Tracy had read aloud before choking up and handing the letter to Garrison so he could finish translating it. I will miss each of you so very much. Each of you, in your own special way, has given me a clear memory of China. You are not just an experience I have had. We are now part of what I am. That's really near the end of the book, and it's well worth your time getting there. The book is called Brave Dragons, a Chinese basketball team and American coach and two cultures clashing, by Jim Yardley. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.